Excellency, thank you for joining us.
What a delight. Thanks for being here.
After just about 7 years in this wonderful building, Rideau Hall, I wonder whether you're anxious to leave or sorry to leave.
Certainly not anxious to leave. It's been a wonderful 7 years, but appropriate to leave. One is asked to do these things typically for a 5-year term, and I was asked to stay on for a further 2 years, so that's a 7-year term. And it's been a joy for my wife and myself to see the country as we have seen it through this office. And one operates one's life in a series of stages. I've been in a university all my life, and typically you take an administrative appointment for 5 years or 6 years as a term, always expecting you'll return to being a professor. I'm a professor of law, and I guess that's the way I see my life, doing this assignment for 7 years, doing it as well as we can, and then moving on to the next stage with many more good things to do.
Okay. I went back and reread some of your speeches that you've given over the time that you've been the Governor General, including your installation speech, and I was struck by how, right from the beginning, you used a term that you've used in countless speeches and public moments since then, which is the idea that Canada is a smart and caring nation. Why was that important to you as a theme?
I think, first of all, because it touches the most fundamental values of the country. We are a country that does have a concern for our neighbor, our community, and therefore our country, that we think beyond ourselves and our immediate family. And throughout our history, I think we've had a sense of sharing experience with others and trying to ensure that collectively we raise our communities and try to ensure that equality of opportunity functions for all of our people, not just selected portions of our population. At the same time, I think we try to do that as sagely, as wisely as we can, and that's the smart part. And again, for me, that's part of the equality of opportunity, especially through our public education system, where one tries very hard to ensure that the opportunity to develop one's talents to the full are available to all of our citizens. And guess what happens when you have an environment of that kind? People find that their talent capacity is even more substantial than they earlier thought it was.
Okay. To some extent, then, it's almost a continuation of your role as a university president. I was also struck by one of the very first speeches you gave after the installation. You spoke to the Ontario legislature. And by the genteel standards of a viceroy, you kind of lit into them on Ontario's research and innovation performance. It was quite a strong speech, because you said, we're not producing enough PhDs, we're not producing enough private sector research. Were you nervous about making that strong as a declaration, and do you think that those issues have been addressed by successive governments?
Well, I think we should have high expectations for our country, and I suppose I've been somewhat of a spokesperson for that. Mm-hmm. This is a good country, and we can do better, because there are parts where we don't do as well as we should, and I think I've seen my role, not simply in this current job, but as an educator, to draw attention to those areas where we can and should do better. One of the studies that I often use to illustrate this is an OECD study that looks at the 33 or so countries of the OECD on the basis of social mobility, and it measures that on the basis of by which children meet or exceed their parents' level of education. That's a good indicator, I think, of movement. And they divide each of the 33 countries into quintiles of population based on the parents' level of education. So for the top 4 quintiles, the top 80% of our population, the children meet or exceed their parents' level of education by a greater degree than any other country. So we're number one in social mobility as measured for that 80% of the population. Now, intuitively, you'd think the last 20%, you've got to be up there in the top 1, 2, or 3. Rising tide raises all boats. We're in the bottom third, and that's such a stark contrast. And why is that so? It's because we have pockets of our population where that equality of opportunity just doesn't work. 4 or 5% of our population are Indigenous people. You know the social indicators as well as I are. They are totally unacceptable in their area, particularly with education. Areas of our inner cities where 2 or 3 generations of people that simply don't benefit from the equality of opportunity that we see through public education. So I often call our attention to those areas where we must and should do better. On the theme of excellence, I remember a meeting, I think in this room, with the King of Holland, King Willem, that we were chairing. We were just down the hall, I guess. We were chairing a panel on innovation. And I said, you know, the Times Higher Education has come out with its annual survey of universities, and Holland, with about half the population of Canada, has 7 universities in the top 100 in the world. We have 97 universities in this country, and we have 3. I congratulate you on how special that is. He said, well, thank you for that. He said, I should also tell you, we have 19 universities in the top 200. That would be about the top 5% of the year. And I said, that's remarkable. We would have 7, possibly 8 in the top 200. I said, how many universities do you have? We have 97. He said, we have 20. And next year, number 20 will be in the top 200. So somehow in that little country, the focus on equality of opportunity and excellence too has been such that they have been elevate all their universities into the top 5% performance in the world. That's the kind of standard that we should be looking at constantly and saying, how do we do better?
Is that something you plan to keep on focusing on in your next life?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any, can you tip your hand on what that role will entail? Or?
It's no, by no means definite at this point, Paul. I've been anxious not to be fixing my next engagement while I'm still in this one, but I will. I'm a law professor, so I'll continue to write law books. We're doing a 6th edition of a book called Canadian Securities Regulation that I first wrote in 1972 or so. I work with my former students. We'll probably do another book called Trust in Canada, looking at the concept of trust, of what it is and why it's important, how you measure it, how you encourage it. The Edelman Trust, that you probably know about their annual surveys, 8 years now. For the first time in those 8 years, Canada's a distruster nation. That is, more than 50% of our population don't trust their public institutions. So we're now around the middle of the pack in terms of that evaluation of trust. We used to be in the top 3rd. So that notion of trust is important to me. I'll continue with a fair amount of pro bono work. I'll chair the Rideau Hall Foundation, which we established to extend the external ambit of the Office of the Governor General and some other pro bono kind of things. And I will go back to a couple of my business interests, particularly on the international sphere and Canada's trade and investment opportunities on a global basis.
Okay. We were chatting earlier and you said that you had been particularly interested in the international component of your role.
Yeah.
How does that fit into everything else that you do? And why did the international aspect jump out for you?
Because it's so important. Important that Canadians see themselves as global citizens as well as Canadians to engage the world. From an economic point of view, to see ourselves as competitive around the world. In terms of international diplomacy and public affairs, to play as constructive a role as we can as a middle power, which I think the world greatly needs some other voices to try to get at the resolution of conflicts rather than the enhancement of conflicts. And I've actually loved that aspect of the role. I'm the representative of the Queen, who's our head of state, but when abroad, I'm functioning as head of state and therefore have the opportunity for remarkable interactions on a personal diplomacy basis with people around the world. So we've done now 56 different country missions. It has not been the custom of representative of this office to do state visits to the United States. We'll do our 7th later this month to the US. And why would you do that? Well, because that relationship is so important to us. And the people-to-people part of it is an important foundation for the other good things. The reciprocal part of that role is welcoming new ambassadors. They present their letters of credence here in a formal ceremony, and then I have an opportunity to meet with them individually. I think I've received somewhere over 250 ambassadors presenting their letters of credence, and for them, that's the first official day that they function. And you want to be sure that the welcome is very warm and very Canadian and they're off on the right foot.
I want to get back to this question of trust because something you just said struck with me, that Canada used to rank near the top of this Edelman Index on trust, and now it's fallen quite a ways back. How did that happen?
I think it's partly the age that we live in generally, and we're going through the relatively early stages of a new communication revolution, the digital revolution. We're still sorting it out, how you establish what is truth. Pontius Pilate's question to Jesus, what is truth, what is authentic? Just to deviate for a bit, one of the other indicators in the Edelman Trust is where do you get your news? Where do you get your facts? Majority of the people of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France do not get their news from respected journals like yours or the traditional media. They get it from social media or ideology or chat groups, etc. I mean, that's fine up to a point. People can involve themselves in trivia, that's fine, and interaction with friends, etc. But if you lose the ability to discriminate as to what is relevant and what has an authenticity to it, you begin to get into some difficulty. So I think that's one. It's the age we're going through of figuring out how to use these new forms of communication. I think also the world is more unsettled today, I suppose partly because of the age of acceleration. Things are happening, change is happening so much more faster than we've ever believed, and it's not linear, it's geometrical. I often use an example to illustrate how rapid that acceleration is now. It took over 3 centuries for the printing press to reach a majority of the population in Western Europe. And it was enormously liberating. It took Western Europe, which was a backward society compared to China, India, Islam, etc., and vaulted it into an advanced society. But it was over 3 centuries for the printing press to liberate the massive population. It took the internet less than 10 years to reach a majority of the world's population. And the internet came into being in 1993, and that's accelerating. We're having difficulty dealing with that, the human capacity. And all the more reason, I think, that we work hard in this country at trying to develop that discrimination of judgment so people can determine for themselves what makes sense, what adds up, what has a track record of authenticity and truth. And that's why good journals like Maclean's are really important in this country.
We will take that endorsement. Thank you very much. Now, you came to office at a time when trust in the office you were inheriting had been strained by the coalition crisis of 2008, by your predecessor's decision to grant prorogation to the Prime Minister. First of all, do you have anything to say about that decision? It's still being debated today by constitutional scholars.
Yeah, we should know more about the Convention of Prorogation and Dissolution. They're 2 different concepts. Prorogation, in fact, is granted quite commonly through the tenure of a particular government, and it's on the advice of the Prime Minister. And the theorists would say that only in the most exceptional circumstance would the Governor General exercise a right or a power that the Governor General has to postpone or somehow deter prorogation, because that would be assuming to a non-elected authority the authority that normally lies in the hands of the people who are elected to govern the country.
Okay. So the guy, Stephen Harper, who came to visit her on that day was the Prime Minister. He was advising the Governor General, and she should take the advice. It's pretty much that straightforward.
Yeah, well, I don't want to get into a specific case of what's right or wrong. What I do want to emphasize is the importance of understanding those conventions, and that with respect to those conventions, there is a theoretical basis for them, and whether one exercises them or not is a judgment on in a particular circumstance, but one must weigh all of the evidence and circumstances to move to not a specific case, but another one of dissolution of legislation. Through the 19th century here in this country, that happened with some frequency at the provincial level with the lieutenant governors. It's almost unheard of now that a lieutenant governor or governor general would exercise that theoretical right. And in my judgment, rightly so. I think the last time it was done in England was Queen Anne's reign in 1707. And in fact, she reversed a bill of Parliament because there was a change of government. And I think that bill was going to allow the Spaniards to build ports in Scotland, which was reversed. And appropriately so, because we live in a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy. And our democratic institutions must function and must function well, and in a democratic fashion. Meanwhile, the Governor General, or the Queen in the case of the United Kingdom, have certain responsibilities. But the responsibility that I suppose would be of greater importance in any one of those critical situations would be, in Bagehot's words, the responsibility of advising, encouraging, and warning. And warning would happen very infrequently, but you certainly would use the power to warn before you would do anything as calamitous as denying a piece of legislation.
Would anyone ever find out about that besides the Prime Minister and the Governor General in question?
Probably not, certainly not from the Governor General. Those conversations should always be under a cloak of confidentiality. What the Prime Minister, who is the elected representative, has to say about those things would be his or her own judgment, but certainly not from the Governor General.
Okay. How much of a sense did you have when you were named to this office very soon after that crisis? To what extent did it feel like your job was to get that sort of question right the next time it was put to you?
Felt highly responsible about it. I'm a lawyer by trade.
Yeah.
And so we systematically, first of all, looked for the precedents that we could gather. Then systematically we put together a table of potential questions that could arise, minority government, et cetera. And then what we thought would be the answers to those questions, and then the principles on which those answers were based. And then the precedents, especially the Canadian precedents, both federally and provincially, because the lieutenant governors of the 10 provinces and the commissioners of the 3 territories have similar powers. And then we've shared that as a confidential document with the other vice-regal members. I'm advised by the clerk, my principal advisor. A wonderful rapport, I must say, with the 3 clerks with whom I've served. And then the Department of Justice with its fine lawyers. But they also advise the Prime Minister, the elected head of government, in certain things. So we found it necessary to have an independent stream of advice in addition to that. And so we have that with 3 people who serve pro bono. And with them, we put together this table that I mentioned and continually update it and share it with our colleagues in the Lieutenant Governor and Commissioner's office.
Huh. 3 clerks you've worked with, 2 prime ministers, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, very different gentlemen. How has the change in Prime Minister changed the way that you carry out your role, and what has the rapport been like?
Well, each one is different, of course. The 3 clerks, each different, each remarkable people in their own way. So true with the 2 Prime Ministers, and my rapport with both has been, I think, very, very good. I've enjoyed it, if one is allowed to enjoy that relationship. I've found it wonderfully learning through them. They are different individuals. Mr. Harper was very disciplined in the meetings we would have, and would have a series of issues on which we would exchange views. Mr. Trudeau is more informal and very spontaneous. I've known him for a long time because our children played together with him and his 2 brothers as lovers of skiing.
Yeah.
So we've known him from the time he was age 6, and so it's been a friendship for a long period of time. And he, of course, was a student at McGill when I was there, a very prominent student, and we had the occasions to interact there. With Mr. Harper, I've known him for a long time as well, probably for, 25 years or so, through his various public policy and political things. And so I should say that for me it's been a wonderful experience to interact with those Prime Ministers, each in different ways.
Okay. Your other main interaction is with the Queen.
Yes.
Tell me about your last visit with her, quite recent.
Well, it was a bit nostalgic there because we both knew it was the last time we would see one another in this capacity. And of course, the Queen is now 91. She is remarkably physically and mentally acute, and it's a wonder to be with her. I think we've had 10 visits over the course of the 7 years. The very first one was really remarkable. We went to visit them in August, a month and a half before I was sworn in, and we were very lucky, Paul, because they spend the month of August at Balmoral in Scotland, and we didn't realize this, but we went with all the formal clothes you can imagine and expecting a high degree of formality. It was anything but. I don't think we ever put on a stitch of formal clothes. As a matter of fact, we came down for breakfast the first morning we were there, and Sharon, my wife, loves horses, and the Queen loves horses. And they were heading out to the stables, as you'd expect 2 horse lovers to do. And Sharon didn't have any appropriate shoes. And the Queen says, "Oh, just a minute, my dear." And she rushed upstairs and came back down. She says, "We're the same size feet, these will fit." So that's what Sharon wore for shoes for the weekend we spent with them. And that was just the beginning of a relationship that we treasure very much. We found both her and her husband so down to earth, so warm. in her case, so very wise. And each time we've had the chance to meet, I have a sense of someone who's seen more history, I think, in its acute form than any living person, and it's been really quite a thrill to be able to interact with her.
I read somewhere that she has been the Queen for every Canadian Governor General, from Vincent Massey, for every Canadian-born Governor General, for instance, Vincent Massey to yourself. When her reign ends, would it be an appropriate time for a debate about the role of the monarchy in Canada?
Well, I'm sure there will be, as this debate is going on at all times, and appropriately so in a democracy. And other realms in the Commonwealth will have that debate. My own view is that we have an active succession. The succession is clear, and certainly my role and that of the other members of the viceregal family is to make that as smooth and as thoughtful as it possibly can be. When I do get into these debates, very often with school children, I say, Canada has evolved since 1867. We're the product of 1,000 years of constitutional history. We have made changes when changes were appropriate in how we govern ourselves, beginning with the British North America Act in 1867, our Constitution Act of 1982. But always be conscious of what it is you want, and if you're making change, why that change seems quite compelling and what you're getting into. And if you wanted to name 10 countries around the world that seem to have government that pretty well satisfies the needs of the vast majority of their people and has a degree of trust, you'd probably have in that list, you'd have Denmark, Sweden, Norway, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. What's common to those? They're all constitutional monarchies with vigorous parliamentary democracies. So something has been working well for us. And I think it is very attractive in a political entity to divide head of state and head of government. Because your head of government has to do with the business of government. And the head of state, in Bagehot's word, has to do with the dignity of government. And so it's appropriate that we look after the honor system in the head of state role here in Canada. And our honor system is the most meritocratic, based on merit, without political influence in the world. And that's as it should be. If you're going to honor people of excellence as people that deserve special recognition, you want to be sure that it's excellence that is pretty well accepted as excellence by the vast majority of your people. So there are advantages to having the two separate. The United States, for example, joins head of state and head of government in one person. That's a big load to carry.
Okay. You've got about one more month in this House and in this role. What do you hope to do with it?
Well, run hard right to the finish line. We were 3 days in the north until we got in at 1:30 this morning here. And that's the 7th visit we've made to the north in the time we've here. Another very important part of that. And I should say again, with emphasis on the north, we took the Polar Medal, 1 medal a year, and that is now up to 50 medals a year to recognize people that have made great contributions in the north. And again, through the foundation, we are the operating manager for the Arctic Inspiration Prize, which we dubbed the Nobel Prize of the North. That will produce a yield of a $50 million endowment, privately contributed, of $3 million this year. So there'll be one $1 million prize, probably two $500,000 prizes, and then a number of smaller prizes, $50,000 to $200,000. And it's to identify initiatives in the north by Northerners that, with an influx of funds of this kind, could be scaled out. So that's been very exciting. So last 3 days in the north were devoted to more understanding of the north and promoting those things. We have a lot of events between now and September 30th, and we'll be running hard. And then we'll finish and take a big deep breath and say, boy, that's been terrific.
I think that about wraps it up. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We appreciate it.
A delight to see you, Paul. Thanks for coming over here to Rideau Hall, the home of the people of Canada.